Tonight, new developments are raising profound questions, not just about the Middle East, but about whether diplomacy itself has any meaning left when the guns never fall silent. Iran is now pulling away from negotiations with the United States. And according to a growing number of analysts, this is not a temporary pause or a tactical maneuver. This looks like a structural breakdown, a moment where the entire logic of engagement may be cracking under the weight of accumulated distrust, military pressure, and regional rage. But the real story is hiding beneath the surface. What we are witnessing is not a simple diplomatic failure. It is a collision between competing realities where military operations continue even as diplomats speak of de-escalation, where domestic political pressures override strategic patience, and where the very idea of sitting across a table has become a liability for leaders on all sides. The timing could not be more dangerous. For months, the region has been stuck in a cycle of strikes, counter-strikes, intelligence, warfare, and proxy battles. Public statements still mention ceasefires and stability. But behind those words, a darker picture is emerging. Observers now warn that we are approaching a zone where miscalculation becomes almost impossible to reverse. The immediate trigger for this latest rupture is Iran's growing frustration with what it sees as bad faith. From Thran's perspective, you cannot claim to pursue diplomacy while simultaneously conducting military operations, tightening sanctions, and moving naval assets into striking distance. That contradiction has eroded whatever fragile trust remained, and the debate has now shifted. No one is seriously asking when talks will resume. The real question is whether any meaningful trust still exists at all. Iranian leadership increasingly views Washington's stance as fundamentally incoherent. Public offers of dialogue are repeatedly accompanied by threats, deployments, and pressure campaigns that look anything but diplomatic. At the same time, Israel's ongoing operations in Lebanon and Gaza continue to generate images of destruction that fuel fury not only among Iran's allies but across broad populations in the region. And that matters strategically because in modern conflicts, public opinion is no longer a backdrop. It is a weapon. It is a constraint. It is a force that shapes what leaders can and cannot do. Across the Middle East today, political atmospheres are shifting rapidly. Governments are being forced to balance military necessities with domestic outrage, ideological loyalties, and the ever-present fear of looking weak under foreign pressure. Several diplomatic initiatives are now trapped between public messaging and ground realities. American officials insist channels remain open. Iranian commentators increasingly argue that negotiations conducted under the shadow of strikes are not negotiations at all. They are rituals of humiliation. Beneath these public disagreements lies a deeper strategic calculation. Some analysts believe Iran has concluded that time is moving in its favor. Despite years of suffocating sanctions, Fran has shown a remarkable ability to absorb external pressure while keeping the state cohesive. Meanwhile, global energy markets remain dangerously sensitive to any hint of instability in the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a massive share of the world's oil passes every day, is not just a choke point. It is a lever, not necessarily for direct military confrontation, but for uncertainty itself. Even the rumor of disruption can send shockwaves through insurance markets, shipping routes, and inflation expectations. That is why central banks, energy traders, and major governments are watching every headline with growing anxiety. For now, oil prices remain below catastrophic levels. But several market observers warn that this calm is built more on expectations than on actual stability. If markets begin to believe that negotiations are permanently dead, the consequences will ripple far beyond the Middle East. This is where economic strategy and military strategy become the same thing. Public statements from political leaders are no longer just diplomatic positioning, they are tools for market stabilization. Reassuring words about possible agreements or ceasefires can briefly calm traders even when real negotiations are going nowhere behind closed doors. But there is another possibility that is now drawing serious attention. Some analysts believe global energy reserves and commercial stockpiles are quietly being adjusted in anticipation of prolonged disruption. If that is true, it means governments and corporations are already preparing for the worst. And that raises a terrifying question. What happens when diplomatic collapse and energy panic begin feeding each other simultaneously? History shows that economic shocks intensify political instability. Higher fuel prices hit transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and consumer costs everywhere. Political pressure on government spikes. Public frustration boils over. Strategic patience evaporates. That is exactly why military and economic observers are hanging on every word from Washington, Tehran, Tel Aviv, Beirut, and the Gulf capitals. The military dimension of this crisis is equally alarming. No full-scale regional war has been declared, but the Middle East is now operating in a dangerous gray zone between open conflict and controlled chaos. Israeli operations continue across multiple theaters. Iranian-backed groups remain active. American military assets are deployed. Naval movements are tracked by the hour. Intelligence operations are intensifying. Cyber campaigns are expanding, and every side is terrified of appearing weak. That fear creates a paradox. Deterrence requires displays of strength, but those displays are easily misinterpreted as preparation for attack. That is how regional crises become global ones. Defense analysts warned that the greatest danger right now is not deliberate war planning, but cumulative escalation. A strike here, a retaliation there, an accidental encounter at sea, a drone intercepted, a missile launched, a piece of intelligence misread. Eventually, the space for restraint simply disappears. Beneath all of this lies the unresolved wound that has haunted the region for decades. The broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Many governments frame current tensions through the language of counterterrorism and national defense. But across much of the Middle East, public opinion sees something else entirely. A struggle centered on occupation, sovereignty, humanitarian suffering, and regional power imbalances. That perceptual divide is becoming strategically decisive. International conflicts are shaped not only by military force, but by competing narratives. Western governments emphasize threats from Iran and its militias. Iranian officials and their allies point to civilian casualties, occupation, sanctions, and foreign intervention. And these narratives are no longer confined to the region. They are traveling across the globe, shaping how other powers position themselves. Russia is watching closely, not because it cares about peace, but because instability in the Middle East affects energy markets, Western military priorities, and global diplomatic alignments. China has even larger stakes. Beijing's economic and energy interests are tied directly to Gulf stability. China has repeatedly called for de-escalation while quietly trying to position itself as a diplomatic alternative to Washington. That is another reason this crisis matters far beyond the Middle East. The emerging global order will be tested by how this confrontation unfolds. Several strategists now believe the world is entering an era where regional wars, economic competition, energy security, cyber conflict, and geopolitical rivalry are merging into a single interconnected system. Crisis can no longer be isolated. A confrontation in the Gulf affects fuel prices in Europe. A shipping disruption impacts Asian manufacturing. A military escalation shapes election politics in the United States. Sanctions reshape global trade networks. Cyber operations hit financial systems. Everything is connected. That is why even limited escalation scenarios are generating extraordinary concern among intelligence communities worldwide. Domestic politics inside the United States are also becoming deeply relevant. Public fatigue after decades of Middle East wars remains significant. Polling consistently shows widespread skepticism toward prolonged military involvement abroad. Rising economic pressures at home further complicate support for overseas confrontations. Some voices in Washington still advocate maximum pressure on Iran, arguing that retreat would destroy American credibility. Others warn that deeper entanglement could ignite the very kind of prolonged instability the U.S. has spent years trying to avoid. And behind closed doors, an even darker question is growing. What if there is no realistic path to a comprehensive agreement at all? Several experts argue that meaningful negotiations with Iran require enormous technical expertise, long-term trust-building verification systems, regional security frameworks, and sustained diplomatic engagement. None of that can be improvised through media messaging or short-term political theater. That is why expectations for any breakthrough remain extremely low. Israeli leadership faces its own strategic dilemmas. Officials argue that national security demands aggressive deterrence and constant military readiness. Critics warn that continuous escalation risks isolating Israel diplomatically while deepening regional instability. And that brings us to the deepest uncertainty of all. Every side believes it is responding to threats. Every side believes it is acting defensively. The deeper concern facing policymakers today is that the Middle East may be entering a phase where instability becomes self-sustaining. In such an environment, every actor believes it is responding defensively while viewing the actions of its rivals as aggressive escalation. When both sides become convinced that they are acting in self-defense, compromise ceases to be seen as diplomacy and instead becomes perceived as weakness. Political leaders then find themselves trapped by domestic expectations, strategic calculations, and public opinion. Any attempt at de-escalation risks being interpreted as surrender, while further escalation is justified as necessary deterrence. This dangerous cycle creates a situation in which diplomacy becomes increasingly difficult, even when all parties understand the devastating consequences of continued conflict. Meanwhile, the humanitarian toll continues to grow. Across Gaza, Lebanon, and other affected areas, civilian populations remain caught between military operations, political rivalries, and competing narratives. International aid organizations, human rights groups, and United Nations officials have repeatedly warned about the long-term social and economic consequences of prolonged instability. Civilian casualties, displacement, damaged infrastructure, and disrupted access to essential services have generated growing concern throughout the international community. Yet, despite mounting pressure from humanitarian organizations and numerous diplomatic initiatives, meaningful international consensus remains elusive. Major powers remain divided, regional alliances are fragmented, and repeated attempts at mediation continue to stall. This inability to achieve lasting diplomatic progress has created fears that the region could become trapped in a state of perpetual confrontation, neither fully at peace nor engaged in all-out war. Such a scenario would carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. Prolonged instability has the power to reshape entire societies. It affects investment decisions, alters migration patterns, influences military planning, transforms alliance structures, and weakens confidence in political institutions. Over time, these changes become embedded within the region's political and economic landscape, making future stability increasingly difficult to achieve. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence involves the psychological impact on future generations. Young people who grow up amid constant conflict, political deadlock, and recurring military crises often develop deep skepticism toward diplomacy and international institutions. When entire generations lose faith in negotiation as a means of resolving disputes, rebuilding trust becomes exponentially more difficult. The damage extends beyond immediate security concerns and begins to affect the very foundations of regional coexistence. Trust, once lost, is one of the most difficult political resources to restore, as despite the increasingly tense rhetoric and repeated episodes of escalation, some analysts argue that a pathway toward de-escalation still exists. However, they do not envision a dramatic diplomatic breakthrough or a historic peace agreement emerging in the near future. Instead, they point to a concept known as strategic exhaustion. The logic behind this theory is straightforward yet powerful. Virtually every major actor involved in the current crisis understands the catastrophic risks associated with an uncontrolled regional war. The Gulf states depend heavily on economic stability and international investment. Iran requires access to energy markets and seeks to avoid complete economic isolation. The United States faces growing domestic political pressures and strategic commitments across multiple regions. Global markets remain vulnerable to disruptions in energy supplies and international shipping routes. As a result, most major stakeholders possess compelling reasons to prevent a conflict from spiraling beyond control. However, avoiding total war and achieving genuine political reconciliation are two entirely different objectives. What may emerge instead is not peace, but containment, a fragile equilibrium maintained less by mutual trust and more by mutual fear of catastrophe. Such a balance would represent a fundamentally different regional order, one sustained by deterrence rather than cooperation. Stability under these conditions would remain vulnerable to sudden shocks, miscalculations, and unexpected escalations. The result would be a Middle East characterized by uncertainty, periodic crises, and persistent geopolitical competition. This possibility raises a series of profound questions that continue to dominate discussions among diplomats, intelligence officials, military planners, and strategic analysts. Can diplomacy recover before distrust becomes irreversible? Does military deterrence genuinely prevent conflict, or does it increase the likelihood of dangerous miscalculations? Are current energy market conditions masking deeper vulnerabilities within the global economy? Can the world's major powers cooperate effectively to contain escalation, or are their rivalries themselves becoming part of the problem? Most importantly, are political leaders still directing events, or have events begun to dictate the choices available to political leaders? These questions remain unanswered. Yet across the region, preparations continue. Military commanders monitor radar systems and intelligence reports. Diplomats conduct confidential negotiations behind closed doors. Energy traders scrutinize every headline for indications of future market disruptions. Intelligence agencies evaluate worst-case scenarios. Governments calculate risks, reassess strategic priorities, and prepare contingency plans. At the same time, millions of ordinary civilians continue living under the shadow of uncertainty, aware that decisions made in distant capitals may profoundly affect their daily lives. The reality confronting the region is both simple and deeply unsettling. Once instability reaches a certain threshold, predicting outcomes becomes extraordinarily difficult. Crises develop their own momentum. Small incidents can trigger disproportionate reactions. Misunderstandings can rapidly escalate into confrontations. Strategic calculations can produce unintended consequences. History repeatedly demonstrates that conflicts rarely unfold exactly as planners expect. For many observers, this uncertainty may be the most important warning of all. The decisions made in the coming months will influence far more than the future of Iran, Israel, Lebanon, or the United States. They may shape the future balance of power throughout the Middle East, affect the stability of global energy markets, test the credibility of international diplomacy, and influence the broader trajectory of world politics. Although the situation remains potentially manageable, an increasing number of analysts believe that the margin for error is narrowing rapidly. Yet another dimension of this story is unfolding far from the battlefields and diplomatic negotiations that dominate headlines. Some experts argue that the most consequential observations are taking place not in Tehran, Tel Aviv, Washington, or Beirut, but within strategic planning centers in Beijing and Moscow. There, policymakers are studying the crisis with extraordinary attention, not merely because of its immediate implications, but because of what it may reveal about the future distribution of global power. For both China and Russia, the confrontation between Iran and Israel represents far more than a regional conflict. It serves as a geopolitical stress test, a test of American military endurance, a test of Western alliance cohesion, a test of global energy vulnerability, a test of international financial resilience. Most importantly, it is a test of whether the United States can continue managing multiple strategic challenges across different regions simultaneously. This is why developments in the Middle East are being analyzed so closely in both Beijing and Moscow. Yet, despite frequently being grouped together as strategic partners opposing Western influence, China and Russia view the crisis through very different lenses. Their interests intersect in some areas but diverge significantly in others. Russia's perspective is shaped primarily by geopolitical competition with the West. China's perspective is driven largely by economic stability, energy security, and long-term strategic competition with the United States. This distinction is critical. While both nations maintain important relationships with Iran and often criticize Western policies, neither appears eager to become directly entangled in a broader Middle Eastern war. Instead, both seek to maximize strategic advantages while minimizing exposure to the costs and risks of escalation. From Moscow's standpoint, prolonged instability in the Middle East places additional pressure on American military resources, diplomatic attention, and alliance management. Every aircraft carrier deployment, emergency diplomatic summit, intelligence operation, and regional security commitment forces Washington to divide its focus. For Russia, which remains deeply involved in Ukraine and continues to confront NATO strategically, any reduction in Western concentration elsewhere can create opportunities. Chinese calculations are markedly different. Beijing's primary concern is not military escalation itself, but the potential disruption of global trade and energy flows. China remains heavily dependent on imported energy, much of which passes through maritime routes connected to the Persian Gulf. Any significant disruption involving the Strait of Hormuz would directly impact Chinese energy security, industrial production, manufacturing costs, and broader economic stability. Unlike Russia, which may benefit from higher energy prices under certain circumstances, China faces significant risks from prolonged oil market volatility. Consequently, Beijing has consistently emphasized de-escalation, ceasefires, and diplomatic dialogue while avoiding direct military involvement. China seeks influence without chaos and strategic leverage without strategic overcommitment, a balancing act that becomes increasingly difficult as tensions continue to rise. The longer the crisis persists, the more challenging it becomes for China to maintain productive relationships simultaneously with Iran, the Gulf states, and Israel. Beijing's ambitions as a global diplomatic actor are therefore being tested in real time. Maintaining neutrality becomes considerably harder as conflicts deepen and political narratives become increasingly polarized. Behind the scenes, Chinese strategists are examining broader questions. How vulnerable is the global financial system to regional conflict? How sustainable is American military engagement across multiple theaters? How resilient are Western economies to energy disruptions? What lessons can be drawn for future geopolitical flashpoints, particularly in the Indo-Pacific? These questions elevate the significance of the current crisis far beyond the Middle East itself. They transform it into a case study for understanding the future dynamics of global competition. What is being observed today is not merely a regional confrontations, but a window into the evolving structure of international power in the 21st century.